that you know?
Yeah. I always heard such great things about Jim Crockett Sr. He was really well respected, not only in the Carolinas with the wrestling fans, but as far as the wrestling business in general was concerned, all the talent, all the wrestlers. He had come to the Carolinas in the 30s and started promoting wrestling. And also they did minor league baseball, the Harlem Globetrotters. He had a hand in bringing a lot of big entertainment events to Charlotte for years. But wrestling was always the backbone. And the Jim Crockett Sr. was a guy who, even though he had money, he didn't show it to people. There's always a story he drove an old car because he said, hey, if the wrestling fans pay their hard-earned money to come to the matches and they see me driving up in some, limousine, then what kind of picture does that throw off? He wanted the wrestling fans to realize that he cared about them and he was just like them. He'd do a lot of his business from a table in a restaurant. He was very old-time promoter all the way, but he was respected because he treated the talent well, and he made sure to take care of the business for the fans.
He was kind of the godfather for what this would become.
Well, exactly. Jim Crockett Promotions obviously wouldn't have been anything without Jim Crockett. And then later on, when Jim Jr. took over, David, Francis, Jackie, they tried to carry that on, but the name that Jim Crockett Sr. had given wrestling in the Carolinas was so strong and so good. But I think he died in '73. That's when some changes were made, and the territory got even bigger.
Okay. You know a lot about tag team wrestling. Just kind of give me, the background of tag. I'm trying to get somebody to give me the history of the tag team wrestling, because it was the tag team territory when he started it. Just kind of tell me a little bit about tag team wrestling and just kind of talk about how the territory was a tag team territory.
Tag team wrestling goes back to the 30s. The first great tag team were the Dusick brothers, the Dirty Dusicks from Nebraska, and they were the first heel tag team in wrestling. Everybody likes to take credit for inventing tag team wrestling. Texas, Paul Bosch would take credit for it, or another territory would take credit for it. Sometimes it was called Australian tag team wrestling. But while nobody really knows exactly the first place it started, the Carolinas for years, the 50s and 60s, was built on tag team wrestling. You had the Kentuckians, the Bolos, who were the Assassins everywhere else, the Scott brothers. The list of tag teams would go on, Weaver and Becker. And it was built as a tag team territory, even six-man tags sometimes when they'd get the manager involved. If Homer Odell managed a heel tag team, then they'd get another babyface and they'd have six-man tags. But it was a tag team territory through much of the 50s and 60s, Rip Hawkins, Sweet Hansen. And that was the way it was built, and that didn't change until after Jim Sr. had passed away. George Scott came in as booker, and he wanted to elevate the singles and elevate the level of talent, bring some new talent in. Because that's one thing about the Carolinas. They were so successful that you almost had to drive the talent out of the territory with a stick, because everybody wanted to stay there. Everybody wanted to homestead. So that's where you got, of course, with that number of towns in just the Carolinas and Virginia, through the 60s and 70s, they'd run 2-3 shows a night. And so even if you were in the territory regularly, Charleston, South Carolina may not see you but once every 3 or 4 shows. So you could stay a long time, but still the changes had to be made. But for 20 years, tag teams were the primary draw in Mid-Atlantic wrestling.
All right, I want to just say a few of the tag team names. Just give me a little short what you think of.
Okay.
And you mentioned a few of them already, the Kentuckians.
Well, Grizzly Smith I got to know real well in Mid-South Wrestling when he was a road agent for Cowboy Bill Watts. But at the time, the Kentuckians were a great attraction. They weren't, let's put it this way, they weren't the Briscoe brothers in the ring as far as technical wrestling, but at that time, nobody was that size. Grizzly Smith was 6'9", 6'10", over 300 pounds. Luke Brown was almost as big, so you had these two giants. The people in the Carolinas, especially back in those days, they loved some hillbillies. They could identify, so they were huge baby faces. The people loved them, and of course they had to have the protagonist or the antagonist to work with the protagonist. So that's where you had the Bolos, who were the assassins, Jody Hamilton and Tom Ernesto. They were the assassins everywhere else, but there had been rip-off assassin tag team in the territory before, so they changed their names and became the Bolos. And the Bolos and the Kentuckians worked for years on and off in a variety of territories, but the Carolinas probably were where they were most successful, and they sold out night after night.
Tell me a little bit about George Becker and Johnny Weaver. I mean, Johnny Weaver continued on after Becker kind of was forced out, but just kind of talk about that tag team just a little bit.
I'll tell you what, Johnny Weaver in the late 80s when he was doing television commentary, I walked over there one time while I was at ringside for a Midnight Express match, and I said, "What are you laughing about, Weaver? My guys are going to win. You shouldn't be laughing. George Becker carried you on his back for 25 years. He started laughing, too. Weaver had come in as a young baby face, good-looking kid. George Becker had been there for years. He had been the booker. He had been a top star. He was getting up in years. So the tag team of Weaver and Becker gave Weaver a rub from the established star, gave the older guy who was in the twilight of his career a chance to just take the tag from the younger kid, and they were successful that way, you know, for a long time. And then finally, it came to the point I talked about. Talent didn't want to leave the Carolinas because the territory was so great. It was great living in the Carolinas. The business was always run well. It was always successful. You made money. And finally, they had to say, you know, to George Becker, from what I've heard, you're too old. No more. So then Weaver had other partners and was successful as a single on his own. But that's how he got the start, by being a partner of the established star.
Tell me about Hawk and Hanson. They were a big staple there too.
Oh yeah. Well, Rip Hawk just passed away not long ago. Hawk was the talker. Hanson was the muscle. And they actually, Hawk later on gave the rub to Ric Flair. When they brought Ric Flair in the territory, his first tag team partner was Rip Hawk. But Hawk and Hanson once again had that formula. They rode together, they trained together, they worked together, never had a cross word, but they were able to, you know, work magic in the ring as a tag team. And they were the antagonists to, once again, to a lot of the popular tag teams. Hawk would go out and he'd do the promo and he'd stir people up. And then he always had the big guy behind him who didn't say that much, but he, you know, look at Sweet Hanson. He could, legitimately, but he looked like he could beat the crap out of anybody.
Tell me about J.C. Dykes. J.C. Dykes and the Inferno.
J.C. Dykes and the Infernos, they were a big team when I was a kid here in the Memphis territory. But once again, J.C. Dykes was one of the old-fashioned, old-style managers, and I mean that in a good way. You know, he had the cane, he got a lot of heat, he had the suits, the tuxedos, whatever. He was Jimmy Dykes from I think, Cleveland, Tennessee. But, you know, paired with the Infernos, they traveled a lot of different territories, but once again, because the Carolinas was such a tag team territory, they had great success there. I'm trying to remember now, scared it out of me, who were the Infernos at that time? It was Rocky Smith.
I have no idea.
Well, just act like I didn't say that, because I can't remember who they were at that time. But, they, you know, and those guys... most of the time when you had masked guys, it's because, for whatever reason, they could work, but they didn't have the appearance. They didn't have the physical charisma to look at them and say, wow, those guys are stars. But if you put the mask on them and add the element of mystery, then, and Mr. Wrestling too, Johnny Walker, he had a whole second career bigger than his first, because Johnny was a great wrestler, looked older than he was, and as he got older, he looked older still. And it was tough to buy him as a main event top babyface. But when he put the mask on and nobody knew who it was, and he'd already retired a year earlier publicly just to throw people off the track, you know, then he was bigger as Mr. Wrestling 2 than he ever was as Johnny Walker.
And there was a lot of masked tag teams back in those days.
Yeah, and the Crockett's, they probably did a little bit of what, probably not as much as what Nick Goulas did. Nick Goulas in Tennessee, when he had a masked tag team, the Interns or the Infernos or the Medics or the Blue Demons or whatever, Goulas had such a big territory that he would run 2, 3, 4 towns in a night over the several state area. And whichever town had the best advance would get the real interns, and another team under the mask would go to the spot show or whatever. I'm not saying the Crockett's did that, but there certainly was an element of switcheroo in those days with the mask guys.
One of my favorites was Skull Murphy and Rupert Nord.
Skull Murphy and Brute Bernard were a takeoff on the classic French Angel motif, the Freaks, because they had that look, especially with the shaved heads, and they weren't, matinee idol guys anyway. So classic heels. And I remember Brute Bernard, after Skull Murphy died, Brute Bernard came here with the Angel, Frank Morrell, the modern Angel rather than the one from the 40s. And Homer Odell managed them for a while, and they were just the three ugliest human beings, and how could you like them? But I loved them because they were great. Brute was crazy, and Frank Morrell was a guy who gave me a lot of advice and a lot of help when I started out. He actually worked with the Carolinas for quite some time also.
And the team that really had the most staying power over that period and went on into the 70s was the Anderson brothers.
Well, yeah.
It was Gene and Lars at first, and then eventually Ole would come in. Just kind of talk to me about them. And
Gene Anderson was the only real Anderson. Lars at first was his partner, and then later on Ole came in from Minnesota. I think Ole always fit better as an Anderson brother as they evolved than Lars did. And of course, there's not much footage left, of the original Andersons. But that's the thing, you save the best for last. We're talking about them. The Anderson brothers epitomized tag team wrestling, and they epitomized what the Carolinas was all about. And even after the change was made from the 50s and 60s, where primarily all the main events were tag team matches, to the 70s, where Johnny Valentine, Wahoo McDaniel, etc., came and established the singles title as being the most important thing, the Andersons were always over. The Andersons, they could work. That's the thing. When a wrestler wanted to get into the Carolinas, they knew they had to be good workers. They knew they had to be talented. They knew they had to be able to go in the ring. They couldn't take shortcuts. It wasn't a territory that relied heavily on blood. It wasn't a territory that relied heavily on chairs and brawling and etc. You had to be able to go in the ring. It was the Cadillac of territories. And Gene and Ole epitomized that. They would ground you and pound you. They'd work the arm. Great tag teamwork, but nobody ever came off the top rope. I don't think Gene or Ole ever. Well, Ole did with the. He'd come off and do the knee on the arm, but it wasn't like he was Ricky Steamboat. But that was the Anderson brothers style, and that influenced not only everybody that came after, but also it influenced who the fans bought as really tough guys and top wrestlers. Because if you didn't look or appear like you could hang with the Anderson brothers, they weren't going to take you as a main eventer in the Carolinas.
I don't know if you know anything about this, but when Jim Sr. died and Junior took over, there was a guy also named John Ringley.
John Ringley.
I don't know if that's really worth going into.
Well,
he was supposed to take over, but he cheated on Francis or something. That's.
Let me give you a sound bite. You can use it if you want to.
Yeah, because we're going to kind of. It might be a little short touch on things since it did happen.
Yeah. When Jim Crockett Sr. passed away, the guy that was first picked to run the company was named John Ringley. He was Francis Crockett's husband, and he had already been involved in the office. I think David at that point was probably had just gotten out of college and was trying to be a wrestler, David Finley, which was
Chevy Silverado, America's most dependable full-size pickup. And Chevrolet.
The job is cleaning, light cooking. I have a really good feeling about this.
You shouldn't be here.
I have a really good feeling about this.
Me too.
The Housemaid. Only in theaters December 19th. Rated R.
As CIO, I brought us from Jira to the entire Atlassian platform. Our PR department.
which was his middle name, and Jim Crockett Sr. said, my boy wants to be a wrestler, treat him just like you treat the other guys. Don't give him any favors. And they beat the piss out of David Crockett, and his wrestling career was short-lived, as I'm sure he would tell you. And Jim Crockett Jr. Was, I'm sure, probably not happy that his father had picked John Ringley to run the business. But that was a transition period of 73 to 74 or so, and then John Ringley got caught with not his finger in the cookie jar, but something else. He wasn't stealing money, but he was not being faithful to Francis, let's put it that way. And as the story goes, he was unceremoniously asked to leave the company and the family at the same time. Then that's when the mantle fell on Jim Crockett Jr. to be the guy to run the company.
And just reading and doing research, a lot of people didn't respect him when he kind of took over because, some people say he was never around it, but some people say he was, I'm not sure. But he kind of had to earn that respect when he got it. And a lot of people say they give him a lot of credit for being smart about bringing in George Scott as the booker.
Well, Jim Crockett Jr. had big shoes to fill, big pants to fill, literally. Jim Sr. was a 300-something pound man. He was a big, larger-than-life guy. He was the promoter that everybody known for 40 years in that area. And all of a sudden, he's gone. There's changes in the company. Jim Jr. is running the thing. And I think he did have to earn the guy's respect. Because let's face it, anytime you follow somebody that's larger than life like that, you're going to have to earn the respect. And in wrestling, it's really hard to get the guys on your side. But at the same time, he brought in George Scott as booker. I never had anything good to say about George Scott from my dealings with him in WCW briefly in the late 80s when Turner Broadcasting bought the company. But I'd always heard that George Scott was the architect of the resurgence of Mid-Atlantic wrestling in the mid-70s. I think it came in large part, yes, he knew what he was doing. He'd been a wrestling star for years. He had been a booker in different places for years. But I think George Scott's biggest talent, maybe he had Alzheimer's when I met him in '89. I don't know. I was waiting to see Genius. I didn't see it. And he was fired 4 months later for not being a genius. But George Scott's biggest talent, from what I've heard, is picking the right talent and letting that talent do what they wanted to do. In other words, he didn't go to Blackjack Mulligan and say, you're going to do this and do that and do the other thing. He'd go to Blackjack Mulligan and say, who do you want to work with? What do you want to do? He would talk to the top guys that he had in the territory that he trusted, the Wahoo McDaniels, the Blackjack Mulligans, the Anderson brothers, etc., whoever it may be. And he would say, who have you worked with in different places that you could redo something, that you had success with? That's actually how the Kentuckians and the Bolos got together for that big program in the 60s. They had worked in different places, and the Bolos would go in and get heat, and then the Kentuckians would come in as the people who could finally knock these assholes off, right? Well, it's the same thing. Wahoo McDaniel would put in a word for this guy or that guy. And of course, then, as a matter of fact, I believe that's how they found Ric Flair, because Wahoo had worked for Vern Gagne in the AWA, and seen Ric Flair on the preliminary matches, but said, hey, this kid's got potential. He's got something. He's going places. Well, if I'm George Scott and I've got a guy like Wahoo McDaniel or Johnny Valentine or whoever that's drawing big money for me that puts their stamp of approval on somebody, I'm going to bring them in. I've actually done that a number of times, when I was lucky enough to be the booker somewhere. This guy's over and this guy knows what he's doing, so if he says the guy's good, I'll take his word for it.
This was the transition from tag teams to singles, and I think the guy that really got that, that focus over was Johnny Valentine. What do you remember of Johnny Valentine?
I was not lucky enough to see him in person. I've seen tape. I've obviously heard a lot of the stories. Toughest guy in the world, had like a Charles Dickens upbringing where he got in the business when he was only a teenager back in the late 40s and was stranded in a foreign country when the promoter left and everything was closed down, and he battled his way to be one of the top stars in wrestling in the 50s and 60s all over the country, all over the world. He was a different guy from what I've heard, but everybody universally says he was the toughest guy in the ring. He wanted you to hit him hard. He wanted to hit you hard. So if he was going to hit you hard, he knew you were going to hit him hard. He didn't care. And he was a guy that took a long time to get over. He didn't do anything flashy. He wasn't going to go out there and do 20 million high spots. He was going to make sure that people believed in him. And then you would bring a guy like that in. You would let him smash himself over by just beating the piss out of people. And then you would find somebody on the other side, the babyface, that the people could legitimately believe had a chance against this guy that nobody could stop. And there came Wahoo McDaniel. And I mean, I've seen Wahoo hit people so hard their chests bleed. Wahoo, when he was a heel and fans would attack him, he would hit them with chops and knock a fan who was not cooperating, ass over tea kettle over 3 rows of chairs with a backhanded chop. And he said he would hit Johnny Valentine as hard as he possibly could, and Valentine would be, yeah, that's it, kid, keep going. Come on, give it to me some more. And they would build those matches to where, you talk to people from the Greensboro Coliseum from years ago, and they'd be sitting in the upper deck, and they could hear Valentine and Wahoo hitting each other. And that's really what built singles wrestling in the Carolinas, because the people would say, well, I don't care what anybody says about wrestling. This stuff's real. Those guys are real. We got to see what's going to happen. And that was the catalyst. And then, you had just the best talent in the 70s come in as far as the singles ranks were concerned, whether it be Steamboat or Piper or Blackjack or Valentine. All those guys could go. They were all world-class talents. So, but Greg Valentine, I should say, 2 of them. But it all started with Johnny Valentine and Wahoo McDaniel, the transition from tags to singles.
Another thing that they did was they created a U.S. title. They kind of made that the main focus, singles title, kind of just talking about how important. I know they had one in Detroit and all other places.
Right.
They finally got one here, and that kind of became the title here.
Well, you had to have, every territory had their regional championships. Even a territory that was affiliated with the NWA would have a regional championship. Now, for years, the tag team title in the Carolinas was the Atlantic Coast tag title, because that was, a regional championship. But then, as tag teams got more important, and Gene and Ole Anderson, etc., they got their own world tag team title. That's one thing. The NWA would not let you have another world champion, but there were a few NWA world tag team titles floating around. The Carolinas version was probably the most important. But also, the singles championships had been the Eastern States heavyweight title. And there'd been a few regional championships, but with the talent level, with the Valentines and the McDaniels and the Mulligans and the Mr. Wrestling, Tim Woods and etc., I think they almost thought that it needed to be more important. It needed to sound bigger. United States heavyweight champion sounds, it's not the world champion, but it's not just the Eastern States or the Southern or it's a little bit bigger. And the talent level deserved it. So when they brought the U.S. title in, they had a tangible prize that these top name wrestlers that you read about in the magazines, that you saw from other territories, from other major promotions, something that they would really want to fight over and prize and it just made, once again, it made the perception of the singles championship and the singles matches more important. Now, back in the 50s and 60s, if you go back through the old wrestling magazines, Gene Gordon was the famous photographer in the Carolinas, but the Carolinas didn't get a lot of magazine coverage. They weren't running the biggest arena in town yet, even though there were weekly shows or bi-weekly shows all through the 60s, and they ran so many events. They weren't drawing the huge crowds, but they were doing steady, consistent business. But the magazines didn't cover them, because Weaver and Becker may be stars in the Carolinas, but because they stayed there for so long, they weren't stars to other places. So the magazines based out of New York would only cover the stars that traveled or the stars in the major media centers. But then that changed in the 70s also. When those big names started coming into the Carolinas, then all of a sudden the New York magazines started focusing on them, and they started getting more publicity. So now instead of, this guy, I'm not going to mention anybody in a derogatory fashion, but instead of a regional star going after a regional championship, now it was a national star going for a United States championship. It was bigger.
About the talent level, just kind of tell me about the talent that they had at this era.
Okay. The talent, especially in the late 70s, as far as nationally recognized wrestling stars, was off the charts. And Greensboro was even though Charlotte was the base of the promotion, Greensboro was the heart. Matter of fact, when Dusty Rhodes was booking and the syndicated TV, both of them played in Greensboro, but there was an A show, and instead of an A and a B show, there was an A show and a G show, Greensboro. because Mid-Atlantic and Worldwide, the G show had a better time slot in Greensboro, so he always booked that secondary show in other places as to be the main show for Greensboro because it was so important. But just in one show at the Greensboro Coliseum, you would have Paul Jones, Ricky Steamboat, Ole and Gene Anderson, Ric Flair, Greg Valentine, Wahoo McDaniel, Andre the Giant, Jack and Jerry Briscoe, Tony Atlas, Bobo Brazil, Mr. Wrestling, Johnny Weaver, Blackjack Mulligan, Stan Hansen, Ken Patera, the Masked Superstar, Baron von Raschke, all on the same show. That didn't happen anywhere else in the country, and the crowds that Greensboro put up were able to pay those guys to be there, obviously, or they wouldn't have been there. But when you see that level of talent at that point in time, and in cities, and let's face it, in the Carolinas that weren't that big in relation to New York or Chicago or Los Angeles, but the level of talent was comparable with anywhere, and the level of work, and so those people, they got to see the best talent, and they got used to good matches. They got spoiled too. You can't keep that up forever. Greensboro was noted obviously for Starrcade, but for years before that, the annual Thanksgiving Tag Team Tournament, which was always a sellout. Greensboro was the scene of Kernodle and Slaughter against Steamboat and Youngblood that set the all-time attendance record and, closed the interstate down. But just regular events in Greensboro, there was one show at the Coliseum in the late 70s that had Harley Race and Ricky Steamboat for the NWA World Championship, Flair against Dusty Rhodes for the U.S. title with Buddy Rogers, the original Nature Boy, as a special referee, and then the Mid-Atlantic heavyweight title, which once again was a secondary title, but that was Ken Patera and Dino Bravo, who were two big stars at that time. And that may seem like a lot of championships, but everything came together in Greensboro. Now, one night, the Mid-Atlantic Championship might be in the main event in Charleston, South Carolina, but in Richmond, Virginia, the U.S. title may be on the line the same night. So people got to see an incredible variety of talent. And now you can put that down.
I don't mind holding it. Another guy that kind of came in the 70s, well, maybe a little early 80s, was Roddy Piper. And people think he was a WWF guy, but he really was hot for Crockett's too. He was so different.
Roddy Piper came to the Carolinas in 1979, and he had already been in wrestling for a number of years, but not on a mainstream basis, not in a high-profile position. I think he came from the Los Angeles territory, which was at that point kind of on its last legs. He had wrestled in Portland for Don Owen. That's where he got his first break as a top guy, but Portland didn't get a lot of publicity. So when he came to the Carolinas, all of a sudden, he could talk like that. The promos were off the charts. And he could also wrestle, even though he was, that big around in those days. He had that mouth, and he could fight, and he could go. And I think it was just something different. The Carolinas at that point was, even though they were used to the top talent, they were used to the big, burly top talent. Whether you were a heel or a babyface, you could get the job done. But then along came this smart aleck kid that everybody wanted to see, get put in his place. And it
Bronze Smart IPL. Enjoy 2 years free from hair and hair removal.
Real strength isn't pushing through pain, it's treating it. When there's no pain, there's more gain. Advil targets pain caused by inflammation for fast, strong relief. Advil, that's real strength.
Cole's mom?
Jonas!
I tried building my kids a dollhouse, and well,
Toy making is more of an elf thing.
I might have used it.
As your host, I have some rules. First, no showers longer than 5 minutes. This isn't a spa.
It took a while. Gradually, the transition came where people had to recognize the talent, and they started to love to hate him, and then they just started to love him. But at first, he had a ton of heat. Crockett got his television on in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1980, I believe it was, which is 90 miles up the road from Louisville. So I found out that if I wiggled my antenna, I could watch Mid-Atlantic wrestling on television back in the days before cable and back in the days before VCRs, really. And obviously, Piper was a huge influence on me. I'm Roddy Piper, and you're not. Well, he's doing Chevy Chase, but nobody in wrestling did any pop culture references then. And then the younger generation came in and it started being more common, but Piper was the first. But then we got the chance, I would throw my friends in the car and we'd go up to Cincinnati and go to the Cincinnati Gardens and see Mid-Atlantic Wrestling live. And that's where I got to see Snuka, who was just an animal, just incredible. The athleticism was unbelievable. And Piper and Flair and Valentine. But I'll never forget, Piper had so much heat, and Cincinnati was a rough town back in those days for wrestling. On the way to the ring one night, I'm sitting like 6th row ringside, and it took effort to get that close because they were drawing big crowds in Cincinnati. But I'm looking, here comes Piper down the aisle, and all of a sudden this guy came out of the 3rd row and just waylaid him with a shot, bam! And Piper sold it and turned around and got on that guy, and they went down, and I'm standing up on the chair, and all I see is Piper's fist above all the other stuff. His fist is going up and down and up and down. He wailed on that guy until the cops could drag what was left of him away. So anybody that thought that Piper was a pushover in Cincinnati from that point on knew different. I mean, when they carried the guy out, he was like that when Piper got finished with him. And he shouldn't have stood up and punched Piper in the face. But he had that kind of heat, and it was the gift of gab, but also he'd get in the ring and back it up.
And the guy that really defined the Crockett era came in during this period. You mentioned his name already, Ric Flair. Just kind of talk about a young Ric Flair. I know they tagged him with Hanson, one of those guys, but really when he got with Valentine and they started to groom him for the top spot, just kind of talk about him some during this period.
Yeah. Flair came in 1974, and that was right when the transition was happening with from Ringley to George Scott. Wahoo had recommended Flair from seeing him in the AWA, where he was still wrestling preliminaries. He'd only been wrestling about 18 months at that point. And he was Fat Rick. He weighed like 280, 290. You know, he was huge. He was in shape, but he was also, you know, he was stocky. Let's put it that way. And you could tell that there was something to him. He had the gift of gab. He had a promo. Even back then, there's never been a gimmick with Ric Flair. Ric Flair, he's been the Nature Boy even before they called him the Nature Boy. So you could see the potential, and they put him with Rip Hawk, who was a veteran. They thought Hawk can do all the talking. Well, then as soon as they heard Flair open his mouth, they said, okay, he doesn't need that. But Hawk was a star. He gave the young kid the rub. I think they might have even been cousins at first, and then that was kind of forgotten about. The plane crash happened. Flair was off for that period of time, but he dropped the weight and came back looking more like the Nature Boy that we know today. But even before the plane crash, he'd been in some high-profile matches. I've seen some video with him and Wahoo where it's funny to see Flair at that size, but he was starting the face-first bump, starting the chops. He was a little over the top, and you could tell he was a little green around the edges, but you could also see that, you know, this guy's going to be a star. And then after the plane crash, when he came back, he was slimmer and sleeker and started to flesh out the Nature Boy gimmick even more, hair a little bit longer, flashier robes, and then putting him with Valentine. At first it was, he not only was a cousin of the Andersons then at that point, but also he was paired with Valentine because it was a great modern day update of the Graham brothers, or the classic bleach blonde, you know, heel tag teams. And I remember Dennis Condrey, when I first got with the Midnight Express and we were successful in Louisiana, Dennis Condrey always wanted to go to the Carolinas because he had started there. He had gotten in the business as a referee in the Carolinas about, 10 or 12 years before the Midnight got together. But he knew the stories, and he knew it was a big money territory, and he said it's the Cadillac of wrestling territories. And he told me Ric Flair and Greg Valentine made $150,000 a year apiece 3 years in a row in the 70s. They were renting limousines to go to the shows just to have a write-off. Well, now that I know Flair personally, I don't know if he was renting a limousine just to have a write-off. I think he was just renting a limousine because it was Flair. But they had the kind of money to do that working in a 3-state area because the business was so strong and they were on top. So Flair and Valentine, especially when they did the program with the Andersons, where you had the two most hated tag teams, you know, in the territory head up, that's when you could see that Flair was going to be a main event player. And then by the time that tandem was at an end and they started working with each other, and Flair had the run with Blackjack Mulligan that did record business. Flair and Blackjack Mulligan, from what I was told, in 1978, were the last people to sell out the Charlotte Coliseum, legitimate, complete sellout, until the Rock and Roll in the Midnight in 1986. They did tremendous business all over the territory. Flair had a ton of heat. People loved Blackjack. That's what really cemented him. Blackjack had been a heel, but after he switched babyface and worked with Flair, that really cemented him as an icon. So it wasn't long after that, a couple of years, they started sending Flair to St. Louis, to Atlanta, to be on TBS, various NWA strongholds, because they knew that he was either going to be or going to be one of the guys figured for the NWA World Title, and they wanted to get him exposed in as many top markets as they could. So he was huge in St. Louis. Sam Muchnick loved him. And he'd take a backdrop on those hard rings. The ring in St. Louis was like an old boxing ring. He went way up in the air, and Flair would take the backdrop anyway. And he went to Atlanta and got on WTBS then, so people could see him on cable. He went to Florida. They traveled him well. He made shots for Vince Sr. in Madison Square Garden. And they traveled him well, so by the time that 81 came around, he got the first run with the belt, the people knew who Ric Flair was, even more so than the Carolinas. But then it set up the dichotomy. Ric Flair, everywhere else in the country, was a dastardly heel when he was the NWA World Champion in the early 80s, but by that time in the Carolinas, he had already become the hometown hero. So he would basically be the hero in the Carolinas and wrestle against the top heels, and then he'd go everywhere else in the country and wrestle the top baby faces. So it was a tremendous learning experience and tremendous exposure for a guy at that stage of his career.
And just kind of briefly, just kind of say something, like this was the time period where it went from just wrestling to being labeled Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. This is kind of when they kind of branded it as Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling.
Okay.
Just something short, and that'll be the end of the 70s, and we'll get into the good old days.
The 70s were the point where instead of just wrestling at the Park Center in Charlotte or wrestling in Greensboro, it became Mid-Atlantic Wrestling. It was branded that way, with the Mid-Atlantic title coming in, so that way they had their own identity. It was a brand name at that point where you could only see the major stars of professional wrestling for Mid-Atlantic Wrestling, and that's, I think, is now what most of the fans in the Carolinas remember is Mid-Atlantic Wrestling.
Okay. George Scott left. I think they had a falling out with Crockett Jr. I'm not sure what that was about. I think we need to talk about that. Just say he left. I'm right. I think Ole Anderson eventually came in and became kind of. I think he had it for a while and was doing Georgia at the same time. And he kind of,
yeah.
And he kind of neglected the Carolinas because he had so much on his plate. I know Tommy Young's told us that he ran it into the ground.
Tommy and Ole always got along real well.
Yeah. But just kind of give me your thoughts on Ole. Just kind of give me something. George Scott left. He had fallen out. Blah blah blah. Then Ole kind of came in. He was the booker and was piss poor, whatever.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think.
I'm not sure. I think it was Ole, and then it was the booking committee, and then.
Yeah. It was the booking committee. Ernie Ladd was involved. The Briscoes were involved. Dory was involved.
Gary Hart too.
Gary Hart was involved.
I'll talk about that too. But I think Ole had it. I think. I haven't talked to him yet.
Well, let me just give you something that you can use or not. But in the early '80s, George Scott left. There was a falling out. I've heard. Not sure, wasn't there, don't know what happened, but he ended up going to work for Vince McMahon. But meanwhile, Ole Anderson came in, and Ole at one point was booking not only this giant Carolinas territory, but also Georgia as well. And the Anderson brothers were pretty much as iconic as a tag team in Georgia, which was a completely different territory, as they were in the Carolinas. Neighboring territories, but at the same point, when you're doing 2 or 3 shows a night in the Carolinas with one crew of talent, and you're doing at least a show a night in Georgia with another crew of talent, and you've got cable television in Atlanta, and you've got syndicated television in the Carolinas, it's a lot on your plate. And even though wrestling wasn't as complicated back then as it is today, and overwritten and overproduced and homogenized, pasteurized, sanitized, etc., it was still a lot. Ole told me one time, he said, all the guys, when I'm booking. They want a day off. What about me? When do I get a day off? I'm the booker. I think of things for people to do. What am I going to do? Get up one day and just not think? I never get a day off. So there was a breaking point where one of them had to give, and that's when they switched and went to a committee of several different people. And Ernie Ladd was involved for a while. Gary Hart was involved. I think the Briscoes were involved. And that, not to cast aspersions on any of those guys, but that period, 83, 84, was probably the only down period in business for Mid-Atlantic Wrestling and for the Carolinas from the mid-70s to the time that Crockett sold to TBS. It was hard to follow the incredible level of talent that they'd had for so many years there. It was also, once again, maybe just that the right things weren't clicking. But in 83 and 84, although the first Starrcade happened in 83, the regular business in the territory was not at the level it was. It was a level people would kill for now. They'd cut their mother's throat to be drawing crowds and business like that now, but then for the Carolinas, it wasn't that good. But Dusty Rhodes had come up with the idea for Starrcade. Dusty, he learned from Eddie Graham. He learned from Bill Watts. Bill Watts learned from everybody learned from Eddie Graham. Eddie Graham was like the learning tree, as Ernie Ladd would say. He was a genius booker. He was an expert in professional wrestling, and he taught a lot of people and passed that down, Kevin Sullivan, etc. And Eddie Graham had been about package shows. Eddie Graham had been about big shows. And Bill Watts took that in Louisiana with the Superdome. Dusty took it to the Carolinas with the idea for Starrcade. And even though Dusty wasn't booking at the time of the first Starrcade, that's pretty much how he got the job, because nobody had ever done that level of business before for one show in one night. This was before WrestleMania. So the idea of the major event was born in the Carolinas, and that would take off for the rest of the 80s. It was huge, whether it be Starrcade in Greensboro, when they were smart enough to keep it in Greensboro, the Crockett Cup, the Great American Bash. Business actually did better as a result of the big events on a regular basis, because instead of people saying, well, I'm just going to wait to the big show, it made everything hotter. It made the whole business hotter. The fallout from Starrcade, well, then we'll go to the Bunkhouse Stampede. Well, then we'll go to the Crockett Cup. Well, then we'll go to the Great American Bash. It was a steady stream that fueled the thing. And Dusty couldn't watch a budget. Dusty was not great for details. J.J. Dillon was. But Dusty was a genius when it came to promoting himself and when it came to promoting a big show.
Well, since you mentioned Dusty, what did you think of him as a booker? He was a genius with the big shows, but what overall as a booker? And then after you talk about that, my follow-up would be the term Dusty finish.
Okay, well, I'll combine them, because
Gain Tango scent boosters. With two irresistible scents coming together, you can't help but dance. Oh wow, that's fresh. Gain Tango scent boosters. More scent, more joy.
Native gives you full thick hair in just one wash.
It's giving clean and craveable.
It must be complicated working with a friend. Stop. But I love you. You need to show the time.
Oh, hi. Work here. I know I've been a little unreasonable.
Because therein lies the rub.
Started to hurt business later